He was a man of God who had lost his faith, secretly paying an atheist to write his sermons. But when his congregation doubled in size, the truth he discovered would shake him to his core. Pastor David Matthews stood 6 feet tall with graying temples and kind eyes that had once sparkled with unwavering faith. For 15 years, he had led Cornerstone Community Church, a modest congregation of barely 60 members in the heart of suburban Ohio. But lately, his sermons felt hollow, his prayers mechanical, and his connection to the divine seemed as distant as the stars. On the other side of town lived Marcus Chun, a sharp-witted philosophy graduate student with jet black hair and skeptical eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. At 28, Marcus had built a reputation as one of the most articulate atheists in academic circles, writing thought-provoking essays that challenged religious doctrine with surgical precision. He survived on ramen noodles and freelance writing gigs, his small apartment cluttered with books by Nietzsche, Dawkins, and Hitchens. David's crisis had been brewing for months. Standing before his dwindling congregation each Sunday, he felt like a fraud. The words that once flowed from his heart now stuck in his throat like sawdust. His wife, Sarah, noticed his late-night pacing, his untouched dinner plates, and the way he stared at blank sermon notes until dawn. Meanwhile, Marcus struggled to pay rent while working on his dissertation about the philosophical inconsistencies in modern Christianity. He'd grown up in a religious household, but had systematically deconstructed his faith through years of academic study, emerging as someone who could argue against religious belief with both passion and intellect. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening when David sat in his study, staring at a blank page that should have contained Sunday's sermon. His congregation was hemorrhaging members to the megachurch across town, and the church board had scheduled a meeting to discuss his declining engagement with the community. In desperation, David found himself browsing freelance writing websites, searching for someone who could help him craft compelling sermons. That's when he stumbled across Marcus's profile, a philosophy writer with exceptional ratings and a portfolio of persuasive essays. What caught David's attention wasn't Marcus's atheism, mentioned casually in his bio, but rather his ability to write with emotional depth about concepts he didn't personally believe. David's hands trembled as he typed the message. "I need someone who can write compelling spiritual content. Are you interested in a long-term project?" He offered $300 per sermon, more money than Marcus had seen in months. Marcus initially thought it was a joke, a pastor wanting an atheist to write sermons? But the money was real, and his empty refrigerator made the decision for him. He accepted, thinking he'd write a few generic, feel-good messages and collect easy cash. What began as a simple transaction evolved into something more complex. David provided Marcus with biblical passages and general themes, while Marcus transformed them into eloquent, emotionally resonant sermons that spoke to the human condition. The atheist found himself diving deep into theological concepts, not to believe them, but to understand how they provided comfort and meaning to others. Marcus's first sermon was about hope during dark times. He wrote about the woman at the well, crafting a message that emphasized second chances and the possibility of redemption. David read it from the pulpit with more conviction than he'd felt in months, and the congregation responded with tears and amens. Week after week, Marcus delivered sermons that tackled doubt, forgiveness, community, and love. He approached each topic with the analytical mind of a philosopher, but the empathetic heart of someone who understood human suffering. His words weren't preachy or judgmental. Instead, they offered practical wisdom wrapped in biblical metaphors. David found himself studying Marcus's sermons like a seminary student, marveling at how someone who didn't believe in God could articulate divine concepts with such clarity and compassion. The congregation began to grow. New faces appeared in the pews, drawn by word of mouth about the pastor, who seemed to speak directly to their struggles. 3 months into their arrangement, something unexpected happened. Marcus began to look forward to their weekly exchanges. He found himself researching not just biblical passages, but also the historical context, the original languages, and the human stories behind the scriptures. He wasn't becoming a believer, but he was developing a deep respect for the wisdom embedded in religious texts. David, meanwhile, was experiencing his own transformation. Reading Marcus's sermons was like seeing his faith through fresh eyes. The atheist outsider perspective stripped away religious jargon and revealed the core human truths that had first drawn David to ministry. His own prayer life, dormant for months, began to stir again. The turning point came when Marcus wrote a sermon about the biblical job, exploring the question of why good people suffer. As he crafted the message, Marcus found himself thinking about his own grandmother, a devout woman who had faced cancer with unwavering faith. For the first time in years, he wondered if there might be something to this faith business after all. David delivered the sermon with tears in his eyes, and the congregation was moved to spontaneous applause. After the service, elderly Mrs. Patterson approached him, her eyes bright with tears. "Pastor," she said, "I've been struggling with my husband's death for 2 years. Today, for the first time, I feel like I might be okay." The church had grown from 60 to over 120 members. The board was ecstatic. The community was buzzing, and David was being invited to speak at other churches. But the weight of his secret was crushing him. The crisis came when Marcus submitted a sermon about authenticity and truth-telling. As David read the draft, he felt like Marcus was speaking directly to him. How can we expect God's blessing when we're living a lie? How can we call others to authenticity when we're hiding behind masks? That night, David called Marcus and asked to meet in person. They sat in a quiet coffee shop, the pastor's hands shaking as he held his cup. "I need to tell my congregation the truth," David said. "They deserve to know that their sermons are coming from someone who doesn't share their faith." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "David," he said finally, "I need to tell you something. Writing these sermons has changed me. I'm not ready to call myself a believer, but I'm not the same atheist I was 3 months ago. Maybe the truth is more complicated than either of us thought." The following Sunday, David stood before his packed congregation with a different kind of sermon. He told them about his crisis of faith, his collaboration with Marcus, and the journey they'd both been on. The sanctuary was silent as he spoke about authenticity, about finding God in unexpected places, and about how sometimes the most profound truths come from the most unlikely sources. "I want you to meet someone," David said, and Marcus walked onto the stage. The congregation held its breath as a young man who had been secretly crafting their spiritual nourishment for months stood before them. Marcus spoke simply. "I came into this thinking I was helping a desperate pastor fool his congregation. Instead, I found myself confronting questions I thought I'd settled long ago. You've grown as a church not because you were deceived, but because you were open to truth, wherever it came from." Instead of anger or betrayal, the congregation erupted in applause. Several members approached Marcus afterward, thanking him for his honesty and inviting him to continue his spiritual journey alongside them. 6 months later, Cornerstone Community Church had grown to over 200 members. David preached his own sermons again, but Marcus remained as a theological consultant and increasingly as a friend exploring faith. The church had become known not for having all the answers, but for being a place where honest questions were welcomed. Sometimes the most profound spiritual truths come not from those who never doubted, but from those brave enough to question everything. And sometimes God works through the most unexpected messengers to remind us that faith and doubt aren't enemies. They're traveling companions on the same journey toward truth. If you like that story, please subscribe for more. Thank you, and until next time.